Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you tonight. We appreciate you joining us. My name is Marie-Christine Nitzi. I'm the president of Harvard Alumni for Mental Health, cutely nicknamed HUM. We welcome you back to this event tonight of HUM. And I wanted to get the event started with just a few words to introduce this event and this series, after which I will very quickly pass it on to the host for tonight, Embry Thompson, and our guest speaker, Barbara Ives. So a couple words of introduction for those of you who are new to HUM or who are returning to HUM after a previous event. HUM is a shared interests group that was created by Harvard alumni in 2014, and that has steadily grown since. There was a renewed effort last year when the pandemic started. A number of us came together and created the COVID-19 task force within HUM that initiated an approach by which we wanted to ask HUM members what their priority needs were and how we could best serve the HUM community of alumni and their families worldwide. And one of the needs that came through this survey was the need for destigmatization of mental illness and the need to have facilitate conversations in our communities around different mental health situations, conditions, diagnoses that we wanted to play an active part in. And Embry Thompson, who is going to be your host for tonight's event, is our scientific director of research at HUM this year, and had this fantastic initiative of creating an advocacy series during which every other month we have the great privilege to welcome a member of the community, a member of the HUM community, who is welcome and offering to share their experience of a certain aspect of mental health. And so I appreciate very much, Embry Thompson, that you are taking the lead on this initiative, and appreciate so very much, Barbara, that Barbara is a good friend of mine, that you accepted to facilitate this conversation with us on a topic that I know is going to touch a lot of the members of our community. So without further ado, I will let you all enjoy the evening and let Embry introduce our guest and get the event started. Welcome you all.
Thank you, Marie-Christine, for that introduction. And thank you everyone for coming today. I see some friends' names, a lot of Marie-Christines. Nice to see you all. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining today. So as Marie-Christine kind of touched on, we started this advocacy speaker series in order to expand the horizons of what we think of as research. I feel like we often assume that understanding comes from like scientists or people with specific set of credentials or people who study certain subjects but don't experience them themselves. And we are hoping that we can empower the personal narrative by inviting members of our community to share their experiences in a welcoming and safe and positive environment. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest today, Barbara Ives. So Barbara received her bachelor's degree in humanities from the Harvard Extension School in 1995, and went on to the Harvard Divinity School from 1997 to 2003. She received her ADHD diagnosis in 2004 when she was 40 years old, and has been a member of an adult ADHD support group sponsored by the Mass Rehab Coalition, where she has delivered presentations on the changes in diagnosing ADHD from the DSM-4 to DSM-5. She's been invited to speak to groups at Mass Rehab, to groups of Mass Rehab counselors, and specifically work with patients and clients with ADHD. And she's also worked with Dr. Nitzi in some of her Harvard pre-college program classes to present on her experience living with ADHD. So this is going to be a very relaxed, but also like enlightening conversation that I will facilitate. So I'll throw in some questions at Barbara, and I really appreciate you being open and honest and vulnerable with a group of people that you just met. So I guess we'll jump into it now. So
yes,
I guess starting off from the beginning, Barbara, you could discuss what it was like when you first were diagnosed. Maybe talk about some of the signs that led you to get tested, Yeah, let's just start
Yeah,
with those questions.
sure, absolutely. Thank you, and it's great to have everyone here. And I hope I do my tiny small part to demystify and destigmatize ADHD in the culture. Um, uh, Thank you. I like. We'll talk about gender in this, but I like many women. I did not get diagnosed until I was 40, and I certainly had my share of troubles prior to that. Um, my story is it has its own, unique twists. Um, just to sort of understand, one of the reasons I didn't get diagnosed earlier is that my own mother passed away when I was 7. So a lot of things that happened were, oh well, she lost her mother. That was the go-to reason for many things that didn't weren't working very well in my world. And I and I had troubles. I was actually a fairly good student. I did pretty well in school. When I was towards the end of high school, junior, senior years, when I started to exhibit some of the more aspects of ADHD that caused me trouble. Um, I started to have trouble writing papers, and my organizational skills were definitely not up to speed. I was able to compensate for a lot of it, so it wasn't totally obvious. But I'd had several instances of just forgetting things, or I got the deadline wrong, or um, I left an important paper somewhere, um, stuff like that, and it sort of threw me because I hadn't really, I suddenly people were a little angry at me, and I was like, I'm trying, and I'm normally a very good student. I think that the increased pressures sort of started to pull away some of that facade. Um, and I after I graduated, I went actually to University of Rochester for 2 years. And by the end of the second year, I developed a really major writing. I didn't know what it was. I could sit for hours, but I could not produce work in the library. And I think that was because there was much less structure when you get to college. And one of the articles I read is like when you send somebody off with that not diagnosed, you basically remove the exoskeleton of their life, so that they're trying to. And I think that's a good description, because I think that's what happened. Um, and I really did not understand. I mean, I was sad my mom died, but I had a stepmother and sibling, and I wasn't really mourning. I didn't think. Um, I did have trouble. So I just wasn't. I'm like, is this really what's going on? I'm not sure. And I think this is, what happens. Um, my, I'm sorry. I already warned Embry. Sometimes I will, I will lose the thread, and sometimes I have to be brought back. But when I, oh, and so by the end of sophomore year, and I said, I can't I can't do this. And so I went home, and I moved back in my parents' house for a little bit, and then about a year or two later, because someone spoke to me about the extension school at Harvard and said you don't have to take 4 courses at a time. And I said, great, maybe I'll do two, and that made it easier. And I was working, but it was manageable. I did drop down to 1 course at a time at one point, because even that was a bit of a challenge. And I I was in therapy, but I've honestly been in therapy most of my life, starting in high school. Um, and depression. I was diagnosed with an adjustment disorder. I was diagnosed with depression, and then it continued, so suddenly became major depression. And it it felt to me like it was cyclical because it seemed to happen regularly, and I didn't know what that meant. Um, that I'd be good for a while, and then things would. And I started graduate school, and I loved being at the divinity school, and so I did that took all my time and energy. Um, One of the things I noticed is when I interned at a church out in Milford, Mass, and and I loved it. But I would get out there, whatever, with if I was preaching or I was just helping with service or whatever special activity. The moment I got home, I literally fell into bed. I was exhausted, and I was like, I don't know what this is. And as I come to understand ADHD, you focus a lot of your mental energy to be present, especially in a church environment where, people are talking to you about important things, which I loved, and I was very present. But the toll it took on me was probably a little bit more than average. Um, and again, I just didn't know why this was happening. I tried other things because there was things in my family. I thought maybe it's family issues that's causing some of these problems. And I'm sure they were part of it, but it was like it's nothing felt quite right. I had a very memorable moment. I remember when I was in high school. Um, I had joined the school paper, and I had written sort of a major article it was a small paper, it was not very big. Um, and Basically what happened is a bunch of people graduated or quit, and suddenly by default I became the editor. And it did not happen for long, but we went into a newspaper conference for high school papers at BU, actually. And I had gone to some workshop, and I think it was about how you focus in on the story or something like that. And I was there. And so the professor's talking to me, goes, well, and then you just, you focus. I think he said something like, you focus or you do this. And, blah, blah, blah. And I raised my hand and I said, how do you do that? And he looked at me strangely, and I was genuinely curious because I thought there's got to be some secret that I'm missing. No, no. And then I thought, well, he has nothing to tell me that's useful. I left. um, but that might have been a clue. I didn't think at the time, but later on, when I think about various moments in my life, I'm going, that was a clue right there. Um, what actually got me to think about ADHD is, this should be no surprise, ad on television. And it was around 2003, 4. I don't remember which medication it was. But I just looked up, there were a number of, in those years in the early 2000s, there were a number of medications that had come on market. And now this was also newly when they were allowed to directly market on television. You didn't have that before. And so the ad that I remember is the main character, her name was Anne. And Anne, Anne, does you get lost in thought at work like Anne? Do you have troubles with these? It was a whole bunch of things. And I was currently going through a lot of that kind of trouble at work. And I thought, well, yeah, I am. And I said, that's, and especially if you're on your own, because you've looked at other things. You don't want to like jump on and say, oh, I have this, because it feels a little too convenient, and you're like pulling, you're being an imposter, as to say that. But I was in therapy at the time, and so I wrote down about 8 pages of things that happened prior to that in my life, and I said, can I go over these with you tonight? I said, I might have this thing. And about halfway through, about page 4, she said, you definitely have it. She has a husband and a child who also have it. She goes, you have it. And I said, are you sure? And she said, yeah. And I had a therapist at that time, a prescriber for medications. I had, that, and so I talked it over with him, and he, said, okay, let's, we're going to try you on. They tried him in Adderall, extended release, and the telling my parents that this had happened was they were sort of like, are you sure? I mean, because you've been pretty successful up to this point. And I'm like, no, I think something's going on. And I said, I'm really exhausted a lot of the time. And it's like, not all these things are that hard. I remember at work, I was in a financial office, and I was in an IT office before that. And I was basically a reception, or just kind of, the administrative assistant. So there's a lot of tasks and a lot of things to keep track of. And I did pretty well, but I spent a lot of time, free time, looking up, like, what they call life hacks, or ways to make things go faster. And so someone said, someone mentions they're having trouble, you should try to do this. I said, and I'm like, no, I'm already doing all of that. I'm way ahead of you. And so because I was smart enough, and because I employed a lot of these things, it wasn't immediately obvious there was a problem, but there was a problem with timeliness mostly, and I had trouble sleeping. But I basically always had trouble sleeping since I was a kid, and so these are the various things. And as I got the diagnosis, and I said this to Embry. I said, I think for most people, you get the diagnosis, but there's a whole process of actually accepting it that you go through. Because if you're not familiar with ADHD, and this was back in the early 2000s, and it was still relative. This was the first commercial where they talked about ADHD in adults specifically, and I think it was heavily leaning towards children having this issue. So the most things on the internet, were about, you have to deal with your kids or teachers, and there really very little information. When it sort of surprised me when I started looking, and the explosion of information in the last 15 years is really, it's amazing, and I'm really grateful for it. And as more people talk about their understanding, more women have it that they didn't realize, and all these things. And that is probably one of for someone going through mental health issues, in some ways, this is where the internet is helpful, because you want to find other people and who are in fact experiencing similar things. That goes both ways, but it can be helpful. I told Embry, this is how I learned to accept my diagnosis. So I worked at Harvard at the same time, and Ned Hallowell, who I'm sure a number of you know by name, was brought in to do a brown bag luncheon. The HR department brought him in. Now, Ned Hallowell wrote a bunch of New York Times bestsellers. Driven to Distraction was like a big one, but he's got a whole series of books. He's a name in the ADHD community, and he has a clinic in Sudbury. I think he has an ad also in town, in Boston somewhere. But and he went to Harvard, and he is affiliated. He's at the medical school. He's a faculty member, and and all this. Anyway, so this luncheon was going to be held in Quincy House, or this brown bag luncheon in Quincy House. And if you come on campus, when there was out of town news, which is no longer there, but when you used to cross from there into the gate in Quincy House was immediately on your right when you went through. And I used to pass it every day. But in order for, and just because I knew I was going to this thing, I double checked on a map of Harvard campus. I said, I think that's it, but I'm not totally sure. And I checked this, said yes. I said, okay, great. And I worked in Widener at the time. So I walked from Widener Library over to Quincy House. And as I'm getting closer and closer, there's a word across the doorway, and it says Lehman, which is the dining hall. And but suddenly you're like, this isn't, I thought this was Quincy House. Am I going the wrong place? And thankfully, I caught something else about that there was like a Mexican company or other that I knew with Quincy House. And I saw a sign for that. I said, "Oh, okay, this is the right place." And um, and so Ned Hollowell comes in, and they do the intro, and he says he starts off a little story, and he goes, "People ask me what it's like to have ADHD every day." He goes, "Let me give you this example." He says, I went to school here. I lived on the quad. You know, he has all these such he turns out he goes to the church across the street, all these things. And he said, when I came onto campus, though, he goes, I was walking up close to the thing, and he says the Lehman thing, and he says, I actually asked a student, I asked someone, is this Quincy House? They're like, yeah. And he goes, and I'm like, I just stopped short of asking someone. But he finishes his story, and I'm like, well, I have it, I guess. Because that was the perfect example. But this was just daily life, and it's like, oh, this is, well, I mean, I think the best example about that is you can't 100% trust you don't, well, you could, but you don't. There's a part of you that doesn't always trust what you thought, because you might have missed something and you're not aware of it. So anyway, that's the whole long story about how I got diagnosed. And that was about a year and a half after, we started with the medication. And when I told my parents about it, the thing is, I didn't know enough about it. They were sort of like, okay, well, what does that mean? And I really didn't know. And it's been a learning process. And the more you learn about how it works, or doesn't work as it is, you discover that a lot of little habits or things or preferences that you had may in fact be because you have ADHD. And there's a little running joke in forums online, like, is it ADHD or is it me? Is that my personality or is that something that I developed because of this? I used to belong to a Facebook group called Smart Girls with ADHD. And people would just post questions like, does anyone here have problems at the beach? And does it bother you? And some do, some don't. And I said it used to bother me before I knew about ADHD, where I started wearing water shoes, and I made sure that I didn't sit right on the sand, that I sat up right in a chair, so that sand, because that really bothered me, and it was a sensory thing. But it, if you didn't, and I can link it back to, this is something that's related to that, but would just be something like a preference. Anyway, that's the long story.
Thank you so much for sharing. There's some questions coming in, and one of them was a question that I was planning to ask you as well. So about how gender impacts the manifestation of symptoms, but also like understanding like society's expectations and gender norms in general, and how that kind of colors the differences between symptoms of like men and women, and maybe non-binary people as well. So can you talk about your experience as a like female identifying person with ADHD, and how that might be different from male diagnoses?
Yes, or I will do my best. I certainly have some opinions on that. One of the things, the current DSM, because I started this when it was switching from 4 to 5, and I do a little presentation on that for Marie Christine classes, because it expanded the criterion. It was ADD, then they added the H to it, which that's still controversial, and but just attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I'm sorry if I haven't specified that. And it used to be that you had to have the certain signs before the age of 7, and a lot of people were like, well, that's called being a kid, and that's not always helpful. Then they switched the criterion to be, it can be anytime up to 12, and that the the three types are, of course, the hyperactive type, and then the inattentive type, which is my official diagnosis, and then there's a combined type. And the stereotype for many years is, little boys who couldn't sit still in the classroom. And it's true that in men, it manifests differently. It manifests more physically. Um, and and for a long time, it was just assumed they were the only one who were really affected by it. It manifests in girls mostly in attention, in your kind of daydreamy, which is certainly true for me, and that you're not totally present in the moment, and or that and you're not um, hyperactive in a way that really disrupts things. I read one piece and someone said that ADHD was named for the ways in which it inconveniences other people, and I have to say a little part of me is like, yeah, that's true. um, the girls tend to the way that it's not enough of a disruption into a classroom in particular, so it was like, you know, people didn't really, unless your schoolwork was really, poor. And a lot of people with ADHD are actually quite bright. And you what you unconsciously learn is ways to cope with your particular thing. Maybe not the most productive, but it's like, oh, maybe I need to go hide out in the music room or, study. I was a library. I didn't want to leave the library. And that was for years. I worked in libraries. And that was a really good environment for me. Um, and then as I got older, it was still a good environment, but I made myself get up and walk around about every half hour in order to stay focused. Um, and uh, it and this is before I understood ADHD. These are just things that I tried out to work. I did a lot of cramming, late night writing. One of the other things that is very common is that you don't have the motivation. So deadlines, as much as we hate them, are pretty much necessary in order to get your your motivation up to the level you need in order to do things. Um, and what happens is people says, well, you're not working on it. In your head, you're working on it. And there's a lot of things going on in the head at the same time. Um, but anyway, so one of the things they talk about is it seemed like ADHD went away because the behaviors went away, hyperactive behaviors. And they learned on that's not really true. Um, they sort of said, well, people develop social skills to like keep it under control, keep it under wraps because of pressure. And that's somewhat true. But what they have now recognized is that a lot of people, and women in particular, sort of didn't have to go from the outward to the inward. But you had this sort of hyper aroused nervous system, and that you um, that it could sometimes manifest physically with physical symptoms, but that there's a huge amount of anxiety because you're trying, especially when you're dealing with peers, you're trying to fit in, and a lot of the things that make you stick out, you're trying to keep a lid on it. Um, you're trying not to interrupt other people when they're talking, or saying something inappropriate because you weren't in the moment, and so a thought came to you and you blurted it out. Stuff like that. Um, so that is the kind of thing that will lose you friends, but did not get help from the outside world. And so I think a lot of people kind of tried to hide that, and not just, be quiet and go along with the crowd. And they weren't sure. There's a lot of social anxiety around that.
Mhm.
As and I have to describe this from other people. I'm not a parent, but I will say this: as you get older, especially when it comes to having children, um, unfortunately, women are still the de facto child care givers, and they do a disproportionate amount of that anyway, right? Without this. The thing, though, is that if you obviously with children around, schedule is incredibly important for their health and just for the optimal functioning. Plus, you have several, probably more than the average thing. So even if you don't, but now there's usually a job or some other thing besides raising children. And it is I have a sister who is recently divorced and she has 3 children. And I had another good friend who had adopted a child, but who was very sensitive to the schedule being scheduled. And if it goes off the rails, then you're in trouble. And so if you're a person with ADHD, under those kinds of circumstances, and especially if you don't recognize it, um, you're gonna be frustrated. You're gonna snap at your partner or the kids, or um, and and either what's going on, and most times you don't. And in fact, one of the very common things, it's probably hopefully going to be less because we're understanding it more, but it was pretty common for adults to get diagnosed when their child, when the teacher said, I think, you should get them tested for ADHD. And that's when they're exploring that. It is very common for an adult going, wait a minute, I have some of those issues. And I mean, I just heard my mother just told me recently about 2 people that one is the son of a good friend of hers, and the other has been a friend of hers, and both took online ADHD tests and tested positive. And I mean, one cried. And because it was like, oh wait, this is maybe what's going on. I mean, they'll have to go get more tests and things, but that's so for a mother in particular, being asked to, you know, keep the schedule going, and even or in they because it's heavily genetic, ADHD. It's not completely, but more than 50% certainly, and it's likely he was never diagnosed, but it was likely that my father had the ADHD, and I can tell you, after my mom died, and my father is a very brilliant man. He went to MIT, he worked at Draper, he worked on the Apollo guidance system. He's a smart guy. But when it was just the 2 of us, we had a housekeeper, but it was just the 2 of us, sort of keeping that part of family living was incredibly difficult for him. And he didn't know how to do that, and a lot of things ran late. Picking up, from things, I was often waiting. And as an adult, as I got older, I have those issues too. It's with the best, even with the best, systems in place, it's still um, your mind will wander. Even if it shouldn't, and it definitely would cause issues. So if you're supposed to be a family timekeeper, you're going to have trouble. But a lot of women, and then people will get frustrated with you. I remember a woman in our support group who got divorced from her husband. She was a lawyer, he was a lawyer, because she left a fork on, they got divorced for a lot of reasons, but she said it was because she didn't notice the fork that had been left on a counter for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something. And husband was waiting for her to notice it, and she just didn't. And that sort of kicked off the divorce. But it is a lot on a partner, and it helps if you know what's going on and you can try and plan for women, parents or families. You really have to have a plan to help soften those edges, those corners. And a mother has almost no time to themselves, and we need time to process things. Um the so anyway, yes, those are all a bunch of my gender thoughts.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And it sounds like, you know, you mentioned that your father also was diagnosed with ADHD, and
I,
you
I,
also.
I'm sorry, let me interrupt. He was never diagnosed with ADHD. Um, I, and this again is something, um, it was pretty, I mean, I'm not a clinician, so I could not say definitively, but, um, my stepmother is, an elementary school teacher, and, she was really good at organizing, uh, things. I was just telling this to Marie Christine the other day. We had a family calendar, um, and then at most meals, we would go, but she'd grab the calendar and like, okay, this is what has to happen on this day, and this is, we have this scheduled and so is going to be here, and like, and I was a kid, like I wanted to hear it once and stop, and it got repeated several times, and now that I look back, I can understand the necessity for that. But the hardest part really with working with ADHD people sometimes is like, you need structure, but it's also something you rebel against. So it's a constant tension going on, and you try to do it, and people get frustrated and yell, and I think a lot of people with ADHD either have two reactions that are pretty common. One is like they get mad and they stomp off, and the other is they withdraw emotionally and socially, because they take any kind of criticism to heart, and they're bothered, and they're already feeling bad about themselves. So when you sort of add, and if they've let somebody down that they care about, which happens unfortunately fairly frequently, then that adds to that mix. Um, and it helps if everyone, if you if you approach it less as a, a well, we don't do this way anymore, but I mean, it used to be considered a moral failing, right? And then now it's, if you realize you're dealing with a disorder that the person doesn't have complete control over, and like, how do we minimize this impact? What system can we put in place? I think that goes a long way towards helping people and making them, with self-esteem and everything like that.
um, no, that was great. Thank you so much. And just like in the interest of time, I guess we have time for from one of my questions, one
Sure.
more of my questions. But so you described, like, there are a lot of people who have a lot of success and are very high functioning people or individuals with ADHD. And I'm wondering how maybe being a high functioning individual impacts the time at which you maybe recognize symptoms, or like any like stigma within the community that you would like to see changed about high functioning individuals with ADHD.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, that's kind of where I was going next. Um, I think the biggest challenge is, and it's become sort of one of those cultural things that people say that if you understood a little better, you wouldn't. You're like, oh, my ADHD was showing because I forgot such and such, and you know, I had a friend back in the day. She would forget something. She says, "Oh, I was having an Alzheimer moment," and it's supposed to be lighthearted and funny, but in fact, to someone who has that, it really is not. And when you'd say you have ADHD to people, I mean, a lot of times it's like, and they say, well, how do you know? Because how do you know? And you say some of the things that you do, and like, oh, well, I do that, on occasion. And the only answer to that is, I'm pretty sure you don't do it multiple times per week. It's just, it happens. I think one of the challenging things is, like, even if you have a routine every day, for myself and some people, not all, it depends, what things interest you, and or how, where your thinking goes. But sometimes even things I know every day, I'll still forget. Like, I know to bring my lunch when I was working, I would forget. They're just getting. One of the examples I like is, I had a pill case because I had pills to take during the day, and I knew that, and I got all my pills into the pill case, and I forgot to put the pill case into my purse. And someone was like, "How can you do that?" And I described it like this: in your head, there's a lot going on. It's a thing. It's a pinball up here, and dinging around, and it it's like, you had that in your checklist. You're like, pills. And the moment you started working on it, you checked it off the list. So that's kind of how things get left undone because you've moved on to the next thing and you didn't finish till the end this thing you were on, which is why they really highly recommend mindfulness, exercises and things for people with ADHD. And for some that can work and others couldn't do it at all. It and the other thing is that when they call ADHD an interest-based system. So I think it's frustrating because a lot of the methods that people use to motivate people, it's like deadlines or threat of bad things happening to you, or an incentive of you could earn some money and blah blah blah, and it doesn't seem to work that well for ADHD people because they're just their motivation is slightly different, and like they can't even project the future. it, ADHD people live in the now. They don't really live in the past or future. It's so their sense of time is just not the same as everyone else's. And that's why a lot of times, until a deadline gets close and like that registers and like that will give them the motivation. Even if they start earlier. One of the things also is that ADHD is really a disorder of making decisions. Because what's great about it is that we will consider all sides and look things to actually again, that's another one of the things. I thought about this thing, so I've done the work. Oh, no, now we need the decision, and that is many of them are just moments where the decision didn't happen, and so you didn't come to a conclusion. Like you recognize the problem and you worked on it, and then it's still in limbo. And I know for people like you're saying to yourself like, oh, I have to clean my room today. Oh, and I should take a shower first, and then I'd like to play some music. And most people would get up and do it in that order. You're still deciding what music to play. And you could be deciding that for 2 or 3 hours. Or, because probably cleaning your room is not something that interests you. The other thing about ADHD is the people say you can't concentrate. And that's not completely true either, because it is a disorder of regulating your attention. So it's, things that are boring, doing housework and where things are not things that motivate you very much. They need to happen and you try to do your best with them. But on the other hand, if there's a new video game and you're really into it, you could do that for 10, 12 hours straight. And someone would be like, did you eat? Oh, I forgot. Because you can focus it's what they call hyper focus. You can hyper focus better than most people. And that, so I know people who have said, oh, but I can do this. And it's like, and ironically, that is a symptom of ADHD. I wanted to tell this one metaphor that I also like about the ADHD brain. There's a lot of them, but the one that I like is about you have a lawn to mow, and most people are using the power, electric, gas powered mowers, and they get the job done. And you're working with a manual. You'll get the job done, but you're going to get there a lot slower.
Mm.
I personally, I remember friends of mine were really into World of Warcraft way back in the day, and they were like doing all this stuff, and I like that kind of thing too. And I was like, oh, that'd be really fun. And then they were showing me how a raid worked, where a group of people work, on a goal and an objective. And suddenly my friend's fingers are flying across the keyboard like really fast, and like, da, 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 da. And I'm like going, is that you do that all the time? And they said, well, just when you're raiding. And I did spend some time in my life, I built characters. I did that. I could never, and I had to stop because I could never get past the rating, which is really the whole point of the game. There's a lot of things you can do, but ultimately it's about that, because I could not process what was happening in the moment fast enough. And I think when I asked my friend that question, it was like, I think I knew in my head somewhere, it's like, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. And I was right, so that, um, anyway, I'm sure I've gone off track here. um,
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying like, it's not like a lack of attention. It's just, sometimes you can hyper focus on certain activities, and then activities that don't really interest you, it's harder to focus on those.
well, especially if you're in a relationship, because if you say that to someone, like, you can, yeah, and this happens a lot, and says, I need to work in the garage, and like you didn't do it, or you're being slow about it or whatever, and someone, they're mad, and they're like, well, you could play your game for, you concentrate on that. And yeah, and you see both sides. It's very right, you're going to be really frustrated by that, but it's also a reality that the other thing is not interesting, and you don't have enough chemical and I don't know, the pathways, neural pathways, to do this, to force you to do it. And so, you know, everyone's really frustrated because you don't want to let the person down, but the reality is, I mean, you have to do it, but you're going to have to figure out a way, maybe using like short bits of time. Okay, I need you to do 20 minutes here, and then every hour or something, so that they can focus for that. Or you need someone to just be there to help guide you, or at even, I've had things where, I've said, like, I just need someone to be in the room talking to me, and then I can focus. Or, go to the coffee shop because there's ambient noise around, people are talking. That doesn't matter because now I'm in the zone. Like, this white noise, to me, and I think other people, the irony is like, oh, you want it really quiet? Like, no, because then, but if it's like this noise, it's like, okay, fine, now I can do the thing that I need to do. And a lot of things about it are just uh, counterintuitive to what you think it would be for a neurotypical brain, and it's frustrating to deal
It's
with.
part of recognizing that it is a brain and different, right? Neurodiversity. We talk all the time about this different way in which the brain processes information. The examples that you gave, I just want to, give a cognitive perspective on that. The video game has been engineered, tested, edited to be engaging, constantly
Yes.
re-engaging, in a way that cleaning your room is not quite as re-engaging by itself, right? And so it's, from the outside, it's easy to see it as, well, you're not interested in that, or you're not motivated enough. But there are also some properties of modulating the attention that have been harnessed by the video game industry, or by certain other, contexts in which your attention is constantly grabbed by design. And so this comparison also is highlighting the neurological underpinning of what you're describing very clearly in the behavior, the experience of it.
Well, yeah, I may have mentioned, or some of the life hacks for to help you study, or they're like, put on video game music in your playlist, and you will be able to concentrate better on what you're studying. So yes, absolutely, that is correct. Yeah. I think in terms of that, in terms of stigma, it's it's hard also to ask your friend. Sometimes you don't know what the thing is. I mean, and that's part of it is trying to learn things that help, um, or how to make it more interesting, or how to build a schedule that, you know, I like to exercise, but if I don't build it into my schedule in a natural way, it does not happen. So I used to walk to work or to the station. It was a mile each way. So that was 2 miles of walking per day when that happened. And so I was like, great, I'm getting exercise. Um, and that was effective. um, anyway, so um,
So we only have a few minutes left, and I wanted to get to one other question from the audience,
Sure.
and then we'll send out a survey, just a satisfaction survey. It's 2 questions for everyone who's in the audience. But there's a question that asks, so to get your diagnosis, you have to demonstrate that you have symptoms before 12 years old. And it sounds like symptoms hit in high school when you started having trouble writing. So can you talk a little about that?
well, I think actually what we know now had been applied to my case. I don't know if it would have because of my mother passing away. They would have factored that in. But there were a lot of instances when I was younger, especially of interrupting conversations, sort of speaking out of turn. Um, just a thing when you are sometimes when people do that in conversation, I think people are more aware of this. They're not. A lot of them aren't trying to be rude. They're trying to say the thing before they forget it. And also trying to relate. It's one way, and they're excited because they found a way to connect, and then it throws the whole thing off when they do it at the wrong moment. That's a very it's also autistic, I know, but it's also a very ADHD type of thing to do. I was a child that was actually not a boy, but also quite hyperactive. And I also had a lot of trouble sleeping. I'm sure you're aware, there is a theory that ADHD is in part a sleeping problem, and that the circadian rhythms are not set in the same way. And I've had that consistently all my life. And I finally said, if I had my ideal schedule, I'd sleep every day from 4 a.m. to noon. And sometimes my second wind of the day comes 11:30 at night. Um, and no matter how much I tried to do the other thing, especially when hormones come into play, because that also affects women. Well, yeah, it affects women. It affects your reaction to things. Like there were times I could literally not get out of bed. I was so exhausted. It happened maybe like one or two, like 1 or 2 days in a month, and then I would know I was starting to get ready for the cycle, and it was people didn't always see it, but suddenly it would be like I was a little more short with people. I was clumsy. I would trip or drop things, and they're not obvious to everyone, but to you, you're suddenly like, oh, this thing is going on, So anyway,
Well, thank you so much for being so vulnerable and sharing so much of your experience with us. We're so grateful for that, and we're glad we could provide a space where you felt comfortable to, be expressive about your experience. So, thank you so much for joining us today, Barbara.
thank you very much for having me. It was a pleasure. All right.
Thank you both. I saw a lot of head nodding. I saw a lot in the audience, like moments of recognition, right? Of like, ooh, yeah, yep, that, and shared experiences that were shared in the chat. We appreciate the audience as well. We think that it's hard to fight the stigma against mental health from the sideline. And this event and broadening conversation across our concentric circles, our respective circles, is one way that we're hoping to contribute. And it starts with people who are willing to share their experience, people who are willing to attend these events and broaden the conversation. We're deeply grateful to you, Barbara, for sharing your experience tonight, and Brave for facilitating a very interesting conversation, and for all of you for joining us tonight. Thank you again.
Well, thank you for the opportunity because I think if I can do anything for future people, it's to share this and so help them have that moment of recognition if they need that or someone that they deal with in their life. Like, oh, it may not be on purpose. um, you never know.
Thank you. I'll leave the survey on for another minute or two. If you guys want to take the time now that the event is concluding to answer this, please know we're taking your feedback into account to design future programming. So we welcome very much your feedback. And we've shared also a link for those of you who might be interested in formally joining Hum now to click on that link and you can join our group. You see that we're a lively community and addressing all of these topics with weekly events that you can find on our websites as well. Once again, thank you very much. And Bray, if you want a conclusive word, and we'll thank our audience for tonight.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. This is my first event that I've facilitated. So I'm really grateful that I got the opportunity to do that with Barbara. And thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Have a
Thank you.
fantastic rest of your night.